"Daddy, she's not moving!" The cry of a little girl sliced through the crowded terminal as a single dad dropped his coffee and sprinted. What he did in the next 30 seconds stopped hundreds of travelers in their tracks and left an entire airport in tears. Before we dive in, drop a comment to let us know where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit, because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind, subscribe. The morning began like any other travel day, with the restless energy of an airport waking up to thousands of stories in motion. Soft gold light spilled through the high glass walls of Chicago O'Hare, stretching long reflections across the polished floor. Ethan Miles held his daughter's hand as they moved toward their gate, their steps unhurried in the early quiet before the first crush of departures. At 7, Ruby was still small enough to marvel at everything: a plane taxiing past a window, the rolling parade of suitcases, the way distant intercom voices echoed like songs from another world. For Ethan, airports had become a practical necessity, not a place for wonder. He worked as a school bus mechanic now, far from the sirens and midnight adrenaline of his years as an EMT. These days, his life was measured in the dependable rhythm of school runs and oil changes, a pace slow enough to mend the cracks left by losses he rarely spoke of. They had a 2-hour layover before the final leg to Florida, where Ruby's grandparents waited with hugs and homemade cookies. Ruby settled into a seat near Gate C-12, pulling out her travel journal to sketch airplanes with the seriousness of an artist. Ethan smiled, watching her tongue peek from the corner of her mouth as she concentrated, then excused himself to grab hot chocolates from the café a few steps away. The smell of roasted beans and the hum of espresso machines filled the air, blending with the distant announcements of boarding flights. It felt almost like a small vacation, a suspended pocket of time where nothing urgent could break through. That illusion lasted less than a minute. A sharp sound cut across the steady buzz, a cry, sudden and out of place. Chairs scraped, followed by a heavy thud that sent ripples of alarm through the crowd. People turned, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Near the boarding line for C-12, an elderly woman crumpled to the floor as if the ground had given way beneath her. A carry-on bag toppled beside her, the wheels spinning uselessly. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Airport staff fumbled for radios, voices overlapping with static and confusion. Travelers clutched phones, eyes wide, unsure whether to help or simply watch. Ethan's head snapped up, just as Ruby's voice rose above the noise, high and sharp enough to slice through every layer of hesitation. "Daddy, she's not moving!" The paper cup slipped from his hand, hot chocolate splashing across the tiles as he sprinted. Years of muscle memory roared awake before thought could intervene. He dropped to his knees beside the woman, his world narrowing to a single point. 2 fingers at the carotid, no pulse. Airway checked, clear. His voice stayed calm, the same tone he'd used countless times on dimly lit street corners and in cramped apartments. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. He began chest compressions, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The numbers became a lifeline. Around him, the terminal dissolved into silence. The usual chorus of rolling luggage and boarding calls faded until there was only the rhythm of his hands pressing life back into a body that had stopped fighting. A young airline attendant crouched nearby, trembling, offering what help she could. Ruby stood close enough for him to feel her presence, like a steady beam of trust, her sketchbook clutched to her chest as if holding on to the moment with all her strength. 30 seconds stretched into eternity. Ethan's arms burned with effort, but he didn't slow. Training and instinct fused into something beyond thought. Compressions. Breath. Compressions. The woman's chest rose and fell beneath his palms, fragile but obedient to the urgency in his movements. A faint sound reached his ears, the distant wail of a medical cart, radios finally finding clarity. But in that suspended time, the official response felt a world away. People gathered in a wide ring, faces pale and tear-streaked. A man in a pilot's uniform whispered a prayer. Someone else murmured, please, 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 over and over. Phones were raised, but for once, it wasn't for spectacle. It was as though every witness felt the gravity of what was unfolding, a fragile thread between life and death stretched across Gate C12. Then, under his fingertips, a flutter, a faint, stubborn pulse pushing back against the silence. Ethan leaned closer, giving a rescue breath, and felt the woman's chest rise more fully. A soft gasp escaped her lips, barely audible, but unmistakably alive. Relief surged through the circle like a physical wave, audible in the collective exhale of dozens of strangers. Paramedics arrived, sliding into the space he created without breaking the rhythm. They attached leads, took over compressions, and began administering oxygen. Ethan eased back, his breath finally catching up with him, and only then did he realize his own heart was pounding like a drum inside his chest. Ruby slipped her hand into his, small and warm and unshaken. The terminal gradually regained sound, murmurs, cautious applause, even a few quiet sobs. But it felt forever changed. Travelers who moments before were strangers now shared something wordless, their lives briefly braided together by those 30 seconds of pure human urgency. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, his knees stiff from the floor, and met Ruby's steady gaze. In her eyes he saw no fear, only trust and a quiet pride he couldn't name. For a man who had left emergency work to escape heartbreak, the irony wasn't lost. He had stepped into chaos without hesitation, proving to himself that the part of him built to save lives had never truly left. Around them, flights resumed, announcements echoed, coffee cups refilled. But Gate C12 held a different kind of stillness, as if the airport itself knew that something rare and irrevocable had just unfolded in its heart. The world narrowed to the thud of Ethan's palms and the silent plea beneath his breath. 1, 2, 3. Each count was measured and sure, a metronome holding panic at bay. He tilted the woman's head just enough to open her airway, his EMT instincts snapping into place as if the years away had never happened. Her skin felt cool under his fingertips, her chest stubbornly still. Ruby stood just behind his shoulder, clutching her small sketchbook like a shield, eyes wide but steady. She didn't cry out again, just watched her father fight for a stranger's heartbeat, as if she somehow knew quiet could keep the thread unbroken. An airline attendant dropped to her knees opposite him, hands trembling, as she offered assistance. "Tell me what to do," she whispered, voice cracking. Ethan didn't look up. "Stay with me. If I say swap, you press here." The words came clipped and calm, the tone of someone who had done this in parking lots and living rooms where every second felt like a lifetime. Around them, the terminal reorganized itself into a loose, reverent circle. Conversations died mid-sentence. Luggage stopped rolling. Some passengers folded their hands and prayed. Others pressed fists to their mouths, tears gathering. Somewhere beyond the circle, a gate agent's voice faltered over the loudspeaker and went silent. Overhead monitors kept flashing departure times no one cared about anymore. To hundreds of strangers, the entire airport had shrunk to the space around a single woman's life and the man who refused to let it slip away. Ethan's breathing quickened, but his rhythm never wavered. He gave a perfectly timed rescue breath, watched her chest rise fractionally, and started compressions again. 1, 2, 3. The steady count became the only sound, a heartbeat borrowed from his own resolve. He felt Ruby's presence like a warm pulse against his back, the smallness of her hand still imprinted on his palm from when she'd called him to action. A figure broke through the ring, a doctor in jeans and a travel-worn jacket, breathless from the sprint down the concourse. "I'm a cardiologist," he said, dropping to his knees. Ethan nodded without stopping. "She's pulseless. Been down about a minute?" They worked wordlessly together, a duet of urgency. The doctor checked for a carotid pulse just as Ethan sealed another rescue breath. Then, faint but undeniable, there it was, a flutter beneath the doctor's fingertip. "She's back," the doctor said, his voice low, but carrying like a bell. A collective gasp rippled outward. Someone sobbed audibly. Another person whispered, "Thank God," as if the floor itself had offered a miracle. Phones that had been lifted cautiously now filmed through tears, not for spectacle, but to preserve proof of something rare and good. A pilot standing near the gate leaned toward a fellow crew member, his voice hushed and reverent. "I've seen emergency landings," he murmured, "but I've never seen a landing like this." The wail of an approaching medical cart finally cut through the hush. Paramedics surged in with oxygen and monitors, their motions precise and practiced. But for a strange, suspended moment, it felt like they were entering someone else's world. For those few eternal minutes, the terminal had belonged only to Ethan, Ruby, and the woman clawing her way back from silence. Ethan sat back at last, sweat tracing a line down his temple. The sounds of the airport crept in, gate announcements restarting, the distant whine of a taxiing plane, but everything felt different, as if the air itself held its breath a little longer. He looked at Ruby, who was still clutching her sketchbook like a keepsake from another lifetime. Her eyes were luminous with something he couldn't name, pride, awe, relief, all at once. He finally exhaled, the pounding in his own chest catching up with him. For a man who had walked away from emergency calls to escape heartbreak, it struck him with quiet force that he had never really left. The part of him built to run toward crisis instead of away from it was alive and steady, and it had carried a stranger back to life while the world paused to watch. The lounge was quiet in a way that felt borrowed, a small pocket of calm pulled from the chaos of the terminal. Ethan settled into a vinyl chair with Ruby curled close, her head resting on his arm, her sketchbook still clutched like a talisman. Beyond the frosted glass wall, planes drifted along runways beneath a whitening sky, the first flakes of snow falling soft and slow. Inside, the air carried a low hum of vending machines and distant announcements, ordinary sounds that only deepened the contrast to what had just unfolded. They had barely sat down when the first ripple of the outside world reached them. A teenage boy in a hoodie, eyes bright with excitement, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, I was live streaming. People are already watching, like thousands. I called it Dad Saves Life at Gate C-12. His voice wavered between awe and disbelief. Ethan blinked, the words landing with almost comic distance from the reality of kneeling on the floor moments ago. "Thousands?" he repeated, but the boy was already nodding, phone buzzing with a constant stream of comments and hearts. What Ethan didn't know, and wouldn't fully grasp until much later, was how fast those 30 seconds had traveled. By the time he wiped the sweat from his brow and guided Ruby toward the lounge, newsrooms in 3 time zones were scrambling to verify a story they could barely keep up with. Clips of his hands pressing life back into a stranger had leapt from one screen to another, retweeted and shared, until strangers on different continents whispered his name like a quiet prayer. Comment sections filled with words like hero, angel, miracle dad. The airport itself had become a live theater for something both ancient and electric. One life handing another back its heartbeat. Inside the lounge, Ethan remained unaware. His world had shrunk to the steady rise and fall of Ruby's breathing against his sleeve. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead and spoke in soft tones meant only for her. "It's okay now. You were so brave." She tilted her face up, eyes searching. "Daddy, is she going to be okay?" There was no easy answer, and Ethan refused to give a false one. "I hope so, sweetheart," he said, voice low and certain. "We did what we could." Airport security arrived first, their manner gentle but thorough. A supervisor thanked him repeatedly, assuring him the woman was in stable care and that paramedics credited his quick action with saving her life. An airline manager followed with the same gratitude, offering water and a quiet corner away from cameras. Ruby clung to his arm as strangers stopped in 2s and 3s, passengers who had witnessed everything, some with tears still on their cheeks. They wanted to shake his hand, to say thank you, for reminding them that courage still exists between departure boards and duty-free shops. Each time Ethan nodded politely, deflecting praise with the same quiet humility. Anyone would have done it, he kept saying, though inside he knew not everyone would have. Outside the snow thickened, soft flakes catching the light like scattered stars. It fell with a hush that seemed to muffle even the airport's endless announcements. The world beyond those glass walls was lit by the glow of phones and breaking news banners, but here the air was slower, gentler, almost sacred. Ruby rested her head again, her grip on his sleeve loosening as if trust itself were a blanket. Ethan let his eyes close for a moment, the echo of those frantic counts still in his chest. He hadn't felt heroic in those minutes on the floor. He'd felt necessary. What he had done wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about doing the one thing that mattered when time itself had narrowed to the width of a heartbeat. The snow kept falling, quiet and endless, a soft counterpoint to the storm of attention gathering outside, a reminder that while the world watched in real time, the most important truths often happen in stillness. The lounge had settled into a soft hush, the kind that arrives after adrenaline burns itself out. Ruby sat cross-legged on the low couch, sketchbook balanced on her knees, tracing a careful heart around the outline of an airplane. The muted snowfall beyond the wide glass wall blurred the motion of planes on the tarmac until they seemed like distant toys in a child's dream. Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, a rare quiet starting to form inside him, until his phone buzzed on the small table with a vibration that seemed oddly insistent. He glanced at the screen and froze. The number glowed like a ghost. Ray Donovan, Captain Ray Donovan, his old EMT supervisor, a man he hadn't spoken to in years. For a heartbeat he considered letting it ring out, but something in the weight of the moment urged him to answer. "Ray?" he said, voice catching with surprise. "Ethan!" The name carried across the line like a memory. Ray's voice was warm, but laced with something heavier, a mixture of pride and disbelief. "I just saw the clip." "Gate C-12, Chicago. That was you, wasn't it?" Ethan hesitated, the scenes of the morning replaying in his mind like a flashback already starting to age. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "You haven't lost your touch," Ray said, and the admiration in his tone was unmistakable. "The way you worked that scene, clean, fast, controlled. Textbook perfect. You saved that woman's life, Ethan." The praise struck deeper than he expected, carrying him back to nights soaked in flashing lights and sirens. He could almost smell the sharp tang of antiseptic and wet pavement, feel the jolt of an ambulance accelerating under his boots. Memories he had packed away with deliberate care rose like startled birds. Alongside them came the darker ones, the call that had ended his career. A wrecked sedan in a rain-slicked intersection, a child in a car seat, his own frantic compressions that changed nothing, the sound of the mother's scream when the world went silent for good. He had walked away after that night, convinced that no amount of training could armor a heart against that kind of loss. Ray seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts. "I know why you left," he said gently. "I was there. But today I watched the old Ethan come back to life. You were born for this work. Maybe it never really left you." Ethan's gaze drifted to Ruby. She was humming softly now, adding tiny stars around the heart she'd drawn. The sight tightened something in his chest. Every reason he had for leaving the field was sitting right there in a tangle of curls and colored pencils. The sleepless nights, the fear of not coming home, the burden of carrying other people's worst moments. He had traded all of that for the steady, quiet certainty of fatherhood. "I don't know, Ray," he said finally, the words heavy. "That life, it took a lot out of me, out of us." "I'm not asking for an answer now," Ray replied. "I just want you to think about it. Maybe your purpose isn't gone. Maybe it's just been waiting for you to breathe again." They talked a little longer, the conversation threaded with old camaraderie and unspoken memories. When the call ended, Ethan set the phone down and let the silence fill in. Outside, snow kept falling in slow, deliberate flakes, each one vanishing the instant it touched the glass. Ruby looked up and offered a shy smile. "Look, Daddy," she said, holding out the sketch. Inside the heart, she'd written 2 words, "Safe, now." Ethan felt a pang of wonder and conflict. He had just proven to himself and to the watching world that the instinct to save lives was still alive in him, as natural as breath. Yet sitting here with Ruby, he knew his own life's heartbeat had shifted long ago. Could he really walk back into the world of flashing lights without risking the quiet life he'd built around her? The question lingered like the snow outside, silent and impossible to ignore, a sign that some choices never really stop asking for an answer. The hours slipped by like a softer kind of time. Snow thickened beyond the glass walls of the lounge, coating the runways in a quiet white that made departing planes look as if they were lifting straight into a dream. Ruby dozed with her head in Ethan's lap, the weight of her trust as steady as the slow rise and fall of her breath. He tried not to replay every second of the morning, but the rhythm of compressions and the sound of her cry, "Daddy, she's not moving," still pulsed through him like a second heartbeat. When a nurse finally approached, she carried the relief of good news in her cautious smile. "She's awake," the nurse said softly. "Her name is Margaret O'Connor. Retired music teacher. She was flying to meet her first grandchild. She's stable now, and asking about the man who saved me." Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ruby stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes, instantly alert when she heard the words. Together, they followed the nurse through a quiet corridor that connected the terminal to a small hospital wing hidden from the public. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something gentler, warm linen maybe, or simply the quiet relief of recovery. Margaret lay propped against white pillows, her silver hair fanned across the sheet like a soft crown. Monitors hummed at her bedside, their steady blips the most reassuring music Ethan had heard all day. When she saw them, she extended her hand with surprising strength. "You?" she whispered, her voice thin but certain. "You're the one." Ethan stepped closer, taking her hand in both of his. "I'm glad you're okay," he said, and for a moment words felt unnecessary. "I don't remember much," Margaret continued, her eyes misting. "Just a voice counting, and a little girl saying, 'Daddy, please?' That's what brought me back." Ruby's cheeks flushed pink. She clutched her sketchbook as if it might hide her, then slowly opened it to the page she had drawn hours earlier, a careful outline of the scene, her small handwriting noting the gate number and a single word, "Hope." Margaret's eyes brightened. "May I keep this?" she asked, touching the page as though it were fragile glass. "It feels like a second birth certificate, proof that I'm meant to keep living." Ruby glanced at Ethan for reassurance, then nodded shyly. "It's yours," she whispered. A quiet warmth filled the room, dissolving the sterile edges. It felt less like a hospital visit and more like a gathering of old friends who hadn't yet learned each other's names. Margaret spoke of her life with a gentle, matter-of-fact grace. Decades teaching music, a husband gone too soon, the trip she'd planned for months to welcome a granddaughter she hadn't met. "I thought I was on my way to a beginning," she said with a soft laugh. "I never imagined I'd need to be brought back for it to happen." Ethan listened, feeling the strange weight of chance and purpose weaving together. When she said she believed his hands had been guided, he didn't argue. He simply replied, "We were just where we needed to be." Outside the window, cameras and reporters clustered near the main terminal doors, eager for quotes and angles, but none of that mattered here. Inside the room, time moved at a gentler pace, the kind that lets gratitude settle deep into the bones. Margaret squeezed Ethan's hand again, and Ruby rested her head on his arm, her sketchbook now part of someone else's story. What had begun as a near tragedy now unfolded as something quieter and perhaps even more miraculous, a friendship born in the space between a heartbeat lost and a heartbeat found. By morning, the quiet that had wrapped around Ethan and Ruby was gone, replaced by a hum that began even before the sun cleared the frozen skyline. Phones chimed, buzzed, and blinked with an urgency that felt foreign inside their modest Chicago apartment. News alerts stacked one after another on his screen. Single dad saves life at O'Hare. The headline echoing across major networks, each outlet threading their own version of the story through the night. Talk shows teased the mystery hero for their morning segments. Commentators debated his background, calling him both ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath. Outside, the narrow street filled with the strange spectacle of media vans and satellite dishes. Reporters leaned against icy railings, clutching coffee and microphones, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had stopped time at Gate C12. Ethan peered through the curtain and stepped back quickly, heart drumming. He'd lived in this neighborhood for years, and no one had ever noticed him. Now strangers knew his name, his past as an EMT, and were digging into the night that made him leave the profession. Some anchors framed it as a triumphant comeback story. Others wondered if this moment was a calling, as if heroism were a career choice waiting to be reclaimed. His email overflowed. Sponsorship offers arrived with subject lines promising easy money and inspirational partnerships. Podcast hosts and national morning shows asked for interviews. A company selling home CPR kits offered to pay for exclusive rights to his name. The sudden attention felt less like recognition and more like a wave he hadn't chosen to ride. Ruby wandered into the living room in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy," she said, tilting her head toward the window where camera lenses glinted like frost. "Are we going to be on TV?" Ethan forced a small smile and pulled her into his lap. "Maybe people just want to talk," he said, though the thought of cameras inside their home made his stomach tighten. He remembered the years after that night on the job when nothing could quiet the echo of a child's last breath. Back then he had walked away from flashing lights and endless sirens to find a quieter life fixing school buses, a life where he could raise Ruby without fear that every call might be his last. He had chosen invisibility on purpose. Now, with the world suddenly watching, it felt like the past he'd worked so hard to bury was knocking on the door. And yet, beneath the unease, something else stirred. The rhythm of chest compression still lived in his hands, a memory of purpose he had never fully let go. In the silence between Ruby's breaths, he felt a strange pull, like a compass realigning. Maybe Ray was right. Maybe the part of him meant for emergencies had only been sleeping. The phone rang again, this time a number he recognized from the hospital. A nurse's voice, warm and direct, carried through the line. Margaret O'Connor was awake and asking to see him. The invitation cut through the noise like a clear note. Here was someone whose life had been returned to her, someone for whom those 30 seconds weren't a headline, but the difference between absence and another morning. Ethan hung up and looked around the small apartment, the worn couch, Ruby's crayons scattered across the table, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. The cameras outside, the inbox full of offers, all felt distant compared to the quiet certainty of the woman waiting to say thank you. He knew this was more than a news cycle. It was a turning point. The world might see a viral hero, but what lay ahead was something deeper. A choice about the kind of life he and Ruby would build next, and whether the heartbeat he restored in someone else was calling him back to a mission he thought he had left behind forever. The hospital room was brighter this time, afternoon light spilling across the polished floor and catching in the silver of Margaret's hair. The steady beep of the heart monitor felt almost musical, a quiet metronome to the stories she began to share. Ruby sat in a corner chair sketching a bouquet of flowers she had noticed on the windowsill, while Ethan pulled a chair closer to Margaret's bed. The tension of their first meeting had lifted, replaced by an ease that made conversation feel like picking up with an old friend. Margaret's voice was soft but strong, each sentence carrying a quiet resilience. She spoke of her decades as a music teacher, of classrooms filled with bright-eyed students and the smell of sheet music and chalk. Her eyes softened when she mentioned her late husband, a man she still spoke of in present tense, as if he might walk in at any moment. "He was my duet partner," she said with a small, wistful smile. "The world lost its harmony when he left too soon." She told them about the daughter who had just given birth, the grandchild she was on her way to meet when her heart betrayed her. "I thought I was headed toward a beginning," she said. "I never expected to need to be brought back for it to happen." Ethan listened, the details settling into him like gentle rain. There was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude, as though every loss and joy had been part of the same long, unfinished piece of music. Then she paused, her gaze sharpening with quiet insight. "I don't think this was an accident," she said. "It felt like a pause, like the world insisting I stop and meet the people who would remind me why we keep trying." Her words landed with a weight Ethan couldn't quite name. He felt Ruby's quiet presence beside him, the child's small world expanding without her even knowing it. Margaret reached for his hand. "You didn't just save me," she said softly, her eyes steady. "You saved a song I hadn't finished." The sentence hung in the room like a sustained note. Ethan felt something inside him shift, an old chord, long silent, beginning to vibrate again. He thought of the years he had spent as an EMT, the rush of saving lives, and the night that broke him, a child's still body, the siren fading into a terrible quiet. He had left that world convinced his purpose had died with it. Yet here sat a woman who believed otherwise, who saw his hands not as instruments of duty, but of something larger and more mysterious. They spoke a while longer, their conversation meandering from music to childhood memories to the small miracles hidden in ordinary days. Ruby shyly presented her drawing of the flowers, which Margaret received as if it were a priceless composition. "Beauty always finds a way back," she whispered. When it was time to leave, she held Ethan's hand again, her grip surprisingly firm for someone who had so recently brushed against death. "Don't forget," she said, "sometimes a single act of courage is the start of a whole new movement." That night, after Ruby had fallen asleep with her sketchbook still open on the blanket, Ethan sat in the quiet apartment and let Margaret's words replay. He thought of Ray's call, of the gentle but unmistakable invitation to return to the work he once loved and feared. He pictured Margaret's grateful eyes, the certainty in her voice when she said he had saved a song. Was it only chance that he happened to be there at that exact moment, or something closer to destiny, a nudge from a universe that hadn't given up on him? The thought stayed with him like a melody he couldn't quite stop humming, a reminder that some callings don't fade. They wait for the right note to bring them back to life. The evening air carried the first hint of spring as Ethan and Ruby walked up the narrow path to a small brick house on Chicago's north side. The house glowed warmly through its front windows, a quiet beacon against the fading light. Ruby held his hand tighter than usual, her eyes bright with curiosity. Inside waited Margaret O'Connor, now days removed from the crisis at Gate C-12 and the family she had nearly never met. Margaret had insisted on one more visit before she was discharged, a gathering to celebrate the baby's arrival, and, in her words, the miracle that gave me another beginning. Emily, Margaret's daughter, opened the door before they could knock twice. She looked younger than Ethan expected, with a calm strength in her eyes that reminded him of her mother. In her arms, swaddled and drowsy, lay the tiny grandchild whose birth had called Margaret across the sky. "Come in, please," Emily said, her voice full of gratitude that seemed too big for the room. She hugged Ethan without hesitation and then bent to greet Ruby, who smiled shyly at the baby. "We're so thankful you're here. You're family now, really." The living room was a world apart from the sterile brightness of the airport and hospital. A soft lamp lit the corner where a rocking chair stood ready. The scent of chamomile tea and freshly baked bread lingered in the air. Photographs of music recitals, and family trips lined the mantel, each frame carrying the quiet weight of years well lived. Margaret sat on the couch with a blanket over her knees, looking stronger than when Ethan had last seen her. "You made it," she said, her face breaking into a smile that carried both relief and wonder. They settled around a low coffee table while Emily poured tea. Conversation flowed with a natural warmth, laughter weaving through stories of childhood memories, music lessons, and the strange chain of events that had brought them all together. Ruby, drawn by the baby's tiny movements, climbed onto the couch beside Emily. The infant stirred and yawned, and Ruby giggled softly, her eyes wide with awe. Ethan watched his daughter's small fingers gently brush the baby's blanket, her carefulness instinctive and tender. Something in his chest shifted, as if a long closed door creaked open to light. Margaret reached for Ethan's hand across the table. "I keep thinking how easily this might have ended differently," she said quietly. "But instead I'm here, listening to my granddaughter breathe, because you were there when I needed you." That's more than chance. Her words settled deep, stirring the same quiet pull he'd felt when Ray called. He didn't argue. He simply held her gaze and nodded, the unspoken truth hanging between them like music without need of lyrics. Emily's gratitude surfaced again and again, each thank you carrying a different weight. Relief, joy, the realization that a stranger had become a cornerstone in their family's story. "Whatever happens next," she said softly, "you'll always be part of us." Family isn't always about years. Sometimes it's about moments that change everything. As the evening stretched on, the conversation meandered from favorite songs to travel dreams, each story stitched with laughter that made the room feel timeless. Outside, the city softened under a veil of early stars, but inside there was only warmth and the steady rhythm of lives gently intertwining. When it was finally time to leave, Emily walked them to the door. The baby slept soundly in her arms, a small heartbeat of possibility. "Let's stay in touch," she said, almost hesitant but hopeful. "This doesn't have to be the end of tonight." Maybe the beginning of something else. Ethan stepped into the cool night with Ruby's hand tucked in his, the sound of soft laughter still echoing from inside. The memory of sterile airport tiles felt far away, replaced by the smell of bread and tea, the weight of unexpected kinship, and the fragile sense that a new chapter had quietly begun, one he hadn't known he was waiting for until now. A thin winter sun slipped across the kitchen table as Ethan sorted through a week's worth of unopened emails. Most were easy to dismiss: interview requests, speaking invitations, sponsorship pitches disguised as gratitude. He had learned to skim and delete without a second thought, but one subject line stopped him cold: Chicago Fire Department, EMS Division, invitation to join as field trainer. He read the message twice. They had seen the footage from Gate C-12, the note began, and were deeply impressed by your composure, technical precision, and life-saving skill. They wanted to know if he would consider returning, not to the relentless rotation of ambulance calls, but as a field trainer. The position was part-time, with flexible hours meant to fit around family life. You could shape the next generation of responders without giving up your home life, the email promised. Every line written with careful respect for the life he had built since leaving the field. Ethan set the phone down and stared out the window, where Ruby's snowman from last weekend leaned slightly under the weight of fresh frost. The thought of stepping back into emergency work sent an old tension across his shoulders. Even as a trainer, he knew the job would pull him back toward the smells and sounds he had tried to forget. The antiseptic tang of trauma rooms, the sudden flatline of a heart monitor, the way silence could be louder than sirens. Those memories weren't just stories. They were scars he carried like hidden bruises. Later that afternoon he called Ray. His old captain's voice came warm through the receiver. "You've still got it," Ray said without preamble. "You proved it at that gate. This role wouldn't be like before. No midnight crash sites, no constant pager. You'd be teaching, passing on the instincts that saved that woman. Ethan listened, torn between the quiet pride in Ray's voice and the ache of old wounds. "It's not just the hours," he finally said. "It's the headspace. I remember everything I couldn't fix." There was a long pause on the line. "I know," Ray answered gently, "but maybe this is a way to honor those memories instead of running from them." Their conversation drifted into silence, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ethan didn't notice Ruby standing in the doorway until she spoke. "Would that mean you're gone at night again?" Her question landed with the weight of a life he had promised to protect. She padded into the room, hair still mussed from her afternoon nap, and climbed onto a chair across from him. "Like before?" she added, her voice small but steady. Ethan reached for her hand. "It wouldn't be the same," he said carefully. "No rushing out in the middle of the night. But it might mean some long days." Ruby looked down at their joined hands, her thumb tracing slow circles across his palm. "I like when you're here for bedtime stories," she whispered. The words pierced deeper than any argument. He thought of the evenings spent fixing old toy buses together, the way she leaned into him during piano practice, the quiet rituals they had built to keep grief and chaos outside their door. Was the heroism everyone celebrated worth risking that fragile stability? That night, long after Ruby had fallen asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with only the ticking wall clock for company. The email stayed open on his phone like an invitation from two different lives. One offered purpose he could feel in his bones, a way to use skills that clearly hadn't left him. The other was the life he had fought to build from the ashes of heartbreak. Steady, ordinary, precious. The decision wasn't about work versus rest. It was about which part of his heart would define the years ahead. The part scarred by loss, or the part that still believed in saving songs not yet finished. Outside, the snow kept falling in slow, deliberate flakes, as if the night itself refused to hurry him toward an answer. Nights stretched longer than the winter hours outside Ethan's window. He lay awake, listening to the radiator hiss and settle, the silence between each sound carrying him back to calls he wished he could forget. Over and over he returned to one memory, a narrow kitchen washed in the cold blue of flashing lights, the smell of wet linoleum and burnt toast. A child no older than Ruby lay still on the floor, small enough to fit inside his arms. He remembered the desperate rhythm of his compressions, the pleading voices in the hallway, the terrible stillness that finally told him it was over. He could still feel the weight of that tiny body long after the stretcher carried it away. It was the night he left the job, convinced no heart could endure that kind of loss twice. Now, with the EMS offer waiting on his phone like an unopened door, those memories returned with full force. Each possibility of rejoining the field arrived with the same question. Could he risk putting Ruby through evenings of not knowing if he would come home? He pictured her sitting at the window when he was late, the same window where she now taped her sketches of airplanes and rescue scenes. That thought alone could stop his breath. Some evenings he padded quietly to her room and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep under a tangle of blankets. On her nightstand rested the travel journal she had turned into a gallery of heroes, pilots, doctors, firefighters, and more than a few that simply read Dad under capes and helmets of her own invention. She drew him larger than life, always smiling, always returning. The sight undid him. She already saw him as brave, not because he ran toward danger, but because he stayed, because he cooked breakfast and checked her homework and never let the world's noise drown their quiet. During the day she worked at the kitchen table, sketchbook open, humming under her breath. Sometimes she would pause and glance up, catching him watching her. "What?" she'd ask, a small smile tugging at her lips. He would shake his head, unable to explain that in those moments she was teaching him more about courage than any emergency call ever had. The city around them moved on, neighbors scraping ice from cars, news vans finally leaving the curb. But inside their small apartment, the question of the offer remained like an unfinished note. Ethan felt the pull of his old purpose, the quick clarity of those 30 seconds at Gate C12 when training and instinct became one seamless motion. Yet every time he imagined saying yes, he also imagined Ruby waiting at the window, tracing the minutes until she heard his key in the lock. The idea of exchanging their steady evenings for the uncertainty of sirens filled him with a quiet dread. One night he brewed tea after she fell asleep and sat at the table with the email glowing faintly on his phone. Snowflakes drifted against the glass, catching the light of a distant street lamp. He thought of Margaret's words, "You saved a song I hadn't finished," and felt their truth. But he also understood something deeper now. Heroism wasn't measured by applause or headlines. It was built in ordinary hours, in the consistency of love that shows up every single day. As the tea cooled and the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan closed the email without replying. He wasn't rejecting the chance to serve, he was recognizing the life he was already serving. Ruby's drawings weren't predictions of the job he needed, but reflections of the father he already was. And in that quiet kitchen, with the memory of a lost child finally easing its grip, he realized that some of the bravest acts never make the news at all. They simply happen in the steadfast choice to be there when someone small calls you home. The invitation arrived on a folded card with a watercolor treble clef on the front and Margaret's careful handwriting inside. A small recital, nothing formal, she'd written. Just an evening to thank the people who reminded me music is meant to be shared. Please come, bring Ruby. Ethan read it twice, the warmth in her words unmistakable. A week later, as the early dusk settled over the neighborhood, he and Ruby climbed the porch steps of Margaret's cozy brick home. The door opened to the sound of soft laughter and the faint perfume of polished wood and tea. Margaret greeted them with a vitality that made her hospital stay feel like another lifetime. She wore a deep blue shawl and a smile that belonged on stage. "I wasn't sure I'd ever host another recital," she said, ushering them in. "But some miracles insist on music." The living room glowed under lamplight. Friends and neighbors filled the chairs, a quiet hum of anticipation threading through their conversations. In the corner stood an upright piano, its mahogany finish gleaming. Ruby's eyes widened at the sight, and she inched toward it, fingertips hovering over the keys like a respectful introduction. Margaret noticed and beckoned her closer. "Go ahead, dear. Try it." Ruby pressed a tentative note. The sound, warm and resonant, filled the room with a richness that made everyone pause. Margaret's smile deepened. "That piano belonged to my husband," she said softly. "He believed every home needs a place where music lives. I kept it tuned, hoping someone would listen again. I think I've found that someone." Ethan felt Ruby's small hand slip into his, a silent question glowing in her eyes. Margaret's next words answered it. "I'd like you to have it," she said. "It needs a home where someone listens." The room exhaled in a quiet murmur of surprise and delight. Ruby's cheeks flushed with pure joy, and she whispered a thank you that barely rose above the strings still vibrating in the air. The recital began with Margaret at the piano, her fingers moving with a grace that defied the weeks since her collapse. Each piece was a story, delicate and strong, full of pauses that felt intentional, as if to honor the silence she had come so close to never leaving. Ruby sat transfixed, swaying to the rhythm, her sketchbook forgotten at her side. The music filled the room like a blessing, weaving strangers into a single, attentive family. Between pieces, Margaret shared little memories, how she and her husband had played duets on rainy Sundays, how each student she taught carried a bit of her heart into the world. "Music is proof," she said at one point, "that nothing beautiful is ever truly lost." Ethan felt those words settle inside him, touching a part of his life he rarely let anyone see, the part that still ached from the call he couldn't forget, the part that had learned to equate quiet with safety. When the final note faded and applause softened into conversation, Ethan helped carry cups and plates to the kitchen. Margaret joined him at the counter. "You didn't just save me," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You brought music back into this house. Into your own, too, I think." He started to protest, but she shook her head gently. "Let the gift stand." The following weekend, he borrowed a friend's truck to move the piano. Ruby rode beside him, her excitement quiet but steady. Together they eased the instrument into their apartment, the scent of old wood and polish instantly changing the feel of every room. As he tightened the last strap and wiped his hands, Ethan realized Margaret's words were true. Saving her had not only returned her to life, it had opened a door to unexpected music in theirs, a sound that promised to linger in the corners of their days, proof that some miracles keep playing long after the first note is struck. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes that night, soft enough to make the city feel muffled and far away. Ethan had just settled with a book while Ruby arranged her colored pencils near the new piano, humming fragments of the songs Margaret had played at the recital. The quiet felt earned, a gentle rhythm after so many restless weeks. Then came a knock, 3 firm raps that didn't belong to a neighbor or delivery. He opened the door to a figure dusted in snow, coat collar turned up, eyes uncertain. For a moment Ethan thought he was staring at a stranger, then recognition slipped through like light under a door. Mark, his younger brother, they hadn't spoken in years. The silence began after their parents died, when grief mixed with arguments over the estate, until every conversation felt like a courtroom. Words were said that neither could take back. Mark had moved across the city, and, for all Ethan knew, across another emotional ocean. Seeing him now was like spotting an old photograph suddenly walking and breathing. "Hey," Mark said, voice rough with cold and something heavier. "Can I come in?" The instinct to keep the door half closed flickered through Ethan, but behind him, Ruby's curious face appeared, bright and open. "Daddy? Who is it?" she asked, her excitement quick as a spark. Ethan stepped aside. "This is your Uncle Mark," he said, the word uncle tasting both foreign and familiar. Ruby's eyes widened with delight. "I have an uncle?" She bounded forward before hesitation could settle in the room. The simple joy in her voice melted some of the ice between the brothers before a single apology was spoken. Mark managed a small smile, brushing snow from his hair. They sat in the kitchen, where the light was warm and the air smelled faintly of tea. At first, conversation came in stiff fragments. How long it had been, the bitter winter, the piano that now filled their apartment with music. Mark's glances kept drifting toward Ruby as she showed him her latest drawing, a miniature airport where stick-figure heroes wore capes labeled Dad. Her easy chatter filled the space their silence had carved. When Ruby left to practice a song on the piano, Mark wrapped his hands around the coffee mug Ethan had set in front of him. "I saw the video he said quietly. "Gate C12, everyone has. I guess I needed an excuse to knock, and that was it." Ethan nodded, unsure how to bridge years of anger with a single reply. Mark stared into the steam rising from his cup. "I was angry for a long time, not just about the estate. I envied you." He looked up, eyes steady now. "You had the courage to walk away when it got too heavy. I stayed, pretended everything was fine, and resented you for disappearing. But when I saw you out there saving someone's life like it was second nature, I realized you hadn't disappeared at all. You were still brave, just in a different way." The words settled like warmth in a cold room. Ethan listened, memories of their childhood flickering back. Shared bedrooms, late-night laughter, the way Mark had once followed him everywhere. He felt the old hurt begin to loosen, like a knot easing under slow pressure. "I missed you," Ethan admitted. "I just didn't know how to come back after everything we said." Mark managed a rueful smile. "Maybe this is us coming back." In the living room, Ruby struck a bright final chord on the piano, the sound ringing through the apartment like an exclamation point. Ethan looked at his brother and saw not the sum of old arguments, but the possibility of something breathing again. Forgiveness, he thought, might be another kind of CPR, pressing life back into a relationship everyone had assumed was beyond saving. And on that snowy evening, with coffee cooling between them and Ruby's music spilling softly into the kitchen, something long dormant began to beat again. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the city, but the story of Gate C-12 refused to fade. What began as a burst of headlines had settled into something quieter, yet more enduring. Parents at Ruby's school stopped Ethan in the hallway, not for autographs or photos, but with earnest questions about CPR and first aid. One mother, eyes wide with memory, said, "I watched that video 3 times. I kept thinking, what if it were me or my child? Could I have done what you did?" Others nodded, asking if he could teach them the basics. Their requests carried the urgency of people who wanted to be ready, not just impressed. Soon local churches and neighborhood groups added their voices. Invitations arrived handwritten on church stationery and tucked into library mail slots. Each message carried the same quiet refrain: "Help us be prepared." Ethan read them at the kitchen table while Ruby colored beside him. The idea of standing in front of a room full of strangers teaching life-saving skills pulled at something inside him. He wasn't sure if he wanted that part of his past brought forward again. Public attention still felt like an ill-fitting coat. Ruby looked up from her drawing one evening as he sifted through another stack of notes. "You can help people even if you're not on an ambulance," she said, matter of fact, as though naming a truth she'd been holding for days. "You already know how, and you like helping." The simplicity of her words settled deeper than any argument. Ethan thought of all the times she had watched him calmly handle the small emergencies of daily life, loose bike chains, neighborhood scrapes, even the quiet heroism of bedtime stories after long days. Maybe she was right. Maybe helping didn't have to mean sirens and sleepless nights. He agreed to one small class at Ruby's school gym on a Saturday morning. It felt safe enough, just a trial. But when he arrived, more than 50 people were waiting. Parents with toddlers, grandparents, teenagers leaning on bleachers. He spread out practice mannequins and began with the basics, his voice steady as he demonstrated compressions. Something shifted as the class moved from tentative motions to confident rhythm. The nervous laughter turned into focused silence, the kind he remembered from the best calls of his EMT days when a team worked in perfect, life-saving sync. Word spread quickly. Soon weekend workshops filled with families eager to learn. Churches hosted sessions after services, and neighborhood associations turned community rooms into makeshift training centers. Ethan found himself moving from place to place with a duffel of equipment, each event less like formal instruction and more like a gathering of neighbors discovering their own quiet power. People didn't just learn CPR. They shared stories of times they wished they'd known what to do, of loved ones lost too soon, of moments when they felt helpless and vowed never to feel that way again. The sessions became circles of trust, places where vulnerability met action. In listening to their stories, Ethan felt his own old wound, the night of the child he couldn't save, begin to soften. After each class, Ruby helped pack up, her small hands efficient and proud. She liked to count how many people had come and how many practice dolls they needed for next time. "We're making helpers everywhere," she said one afternoon, her eyes alight. Walking home with her through the crisp evening air, Ethan realized these gatherings were more than lessons. They were a way of turning personal pain into collective strength, of converting the weight of one near tragedy into ripples of readiness and care. The world had first called him a hero for 30 seconds of courage at an airport. But here, in school gyms and church basements filled with ordinary neighbors learning to save one another, he began to see heroism differently. not as a single dramatic act, but as something steady and shared, a quiet awakening that could keep spreading long after the cameras were gone. The invitation arrived in a cheerful text from Emily on a mild spring morning. "Come for dinner? Nothing fancy? Just a proper thank you." Ethan almost replied with a polite excuse, but Ruby caught sight of the message and grinned. "Dinner with the baby," she exclaimed, as if that settled everything. By evening, they were climbing the steps of Emily's townhouse, a modest brick home glowing with the warmth of lights behind lace curtains. Emily greeted them with flour on her sweater and a quick, easy hug that felt more like welcome than formality. "I may have overestimated my cooking skills," she said with a rueful laugh, waving them inside. The kitchen smelled of roasted tomatoes and something faintly smoky. When Ethan offered help, she handed him a wooden spoon and pointed to a pot that hissed gently on the stove. "Stir if you want to save dinner," she teased. From the start, the evening felt less like ceremony and more like a reunion of old friends. Margaret sat at the table, a shawl around her shoulders, and the baby sleeping soundly in a bassinet beside her. Ruby knelt near the baby almost immediately, whispering soft nonsense and giggling each time a tiny hand twitched. The sound of her laughter folded into the clatter of dishes and the warm hum of conversation, filling the house with something more lasting than gratitude. In the kitchen, Emily reached for a tray of garlic bread just as the timer rang, and winced at the sight of edges gone a shade too dark. She looked at Ethan and burst into a self-deprecating laugh. "Well, there's our humble twist," she said, setting the tray down with theatrical care. Ethan chuckled, offering to slice away the most charred pieces. The small mishap broke whatever thin layer of formality remained, and soon they were talking as if years, not days, connected them. Stories flowed easily, Margaret's memories of music-filled classrooms, Emily's recollections of childhood road trips, Ethan's tales of fixing buses in Chicago winters that never seemed to end. They traded small confessions, losses endured, the long work of resilience, without the heavy silence that usually follows such subjects. Emily listened with a quiet attentiveness that felt rare. When she spoke of her own struggles after her husband left years ago, it was with the same steady candor. "Life doesn't ask if we're ready," she said softly. "It just shows up and waits to see if we'll keep singing." Ethan found himself meeting her gaze longer than he meant to, noticing the quiet strength there, the kind that doesn't announce itself but steadies a room. Something subtle began to settle between them, a recognition not of perfect lives, but of parallel journeys, two people who had learned to keep moving when grief tried to anchor them. After dinner, they carried coffee and dessert to the living room where Ruby and Margaret were laughing over an old music box that played a faint waltz. The baby stirred, and Ruby placed a tiny finger against her lips, the universal sign for silence. Emily watched them, a softness in her eyes that matched the warmth Ethan felt rising unbidden in his chest. As the evening wound down, coats were fetched and dishes stacked, but no one seemed eager for goodbye. Emily walked them to the door, the baby now asleep on her shoulder. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Let's not make this a one-time thing. Maybe we could all get together again soon." Outside, the city night smelled of rain and early blossoms. Ruby skipped ahead, still humming the waltz from the music box. Ethan lingered a moment on the steps, feeling the gentle shift inside him like a door opening to a room he hadn't dared imagine since losing his wife. Nothing about the evening had been planned beyond dinner and thanks, yet something unmistakable had begun to take root, a quiet companionship that didn't erase grief but grew alongside it, steady and patient as the spring air itself. The first time Ethan pulled on the Navy EMS jacket again, the fabric felt heavier than he remembered. The patch on the sleeve caught the fluorescent light of the station hallway, a quiet emblem of a life he thought he'd left behind. He had agreed to volunteer just one night a week, training recruits instead of chasing sirens, but even that small step back carried the thrum of memory. As he walked past rows of gleaming ambulances, old sounds stirred. The snap of latex gloves, the quick clatter of a gurney wheel, the clipped voices that came when seconds mattered. For a moment the years folded in on themselves, and he was 28 again, heart pounding with the weight of lives in his hands. Yet, as the evening unfolded, a surprising calm began to settle where he expected old anxiety. The room of new recruits, eager, a little nervous, notebooks open, looked at him with the kind of respect that asked for more than textbook drills. He began with practical instruction, but quickly found himself speaking about something deeper, the human side of crisis. He told them about the small details that matter, a steady voice that calms a child, the way to notice a family member's silent panic, how to remember that every call is someone's worst night, not just another case on a chart. As he demonstrated chest compressions and airway checks, he emphasized eye contact and compassion as much as technique. The recruits listened intently, their questions thoughtful, their movements careful. When one asked how to cope with the calls that don't end in triumph, Ethan paused, feeling the echo of the child he hadn't been able to save. "You remember the person," he said quietly, "not just the outcome. You carry them with respect, not regret. That's how you keep going without losing who you are." The room stayed silent for a beat. The kind of silence that feels like understanding. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Instead of the frantic rush he associated with his old life, he felt a steady rhythm, teaching, guiding, shaping the next generation without the jagged edge of constant risk. When he finally hung the jacket back on its hook and stepped into the crisp night, he realized the evening had left him tired in body, but lighter in spirit. Back home, the apartment was warm with the smell of cocoa and faint piano notes from the upright in the corner. Ruby had stayed awake, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. She looked up with a grin as he opened the door. "You're late," she said, though her eyes sparkled more with excitement than reproach. "Did you save someone?" Ethan smiled and set his bag down. "Not tonight. I taught people how to help, so they can be ready when it's needed." She handed him a steaming mug of hot chocolate and settled beside him on the couch, her head resting against his arm. "That's even better," she said, after a thoughtful pause. "Now lots of people can help, not just you." Her simple wisdom landed deeper than she knew. He sipped the cocoa and listened as she asked for stories about the trainees, wanting to know their names, what made them nervous, what made them brave. In the quiet of their living room, with snow beginning to dust the window ledge, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected: balance. The work still mattered, deeply, but it no longer threatened the fragile world he and Ruby had built. As she drifted to sleep against his side, he understood that this was the answer he'd been searching for. He could honor the calling that still lived in his hands without sacrificing the constancy that gave his daughter security and joy. The night's gentle close was proof that sometimes purpose doesn't demand a return to the front lines. Sometimes it asks only for the courage to teach, to guide, and to come home to the life waiting faithfully at the end of every shift. A thin spring rain slicked the pavement outside Chicago O'Hare, turning the runways into mirrors of gray and silver. Inside the terminal, morning travelers hurried past with rolling bags and muffled conversations, unaware that a quiet ceremony was about to begin at Gate C-12. Ethan walked beside Ruby, their steps unhurried. Margaret, recovered and radiant in a soft lavender coat, kept pace with them, her smile steady, as if she carried her own secret music. Airport officials had invited them to a small moment of gratitude, nothing grand or televised, just a gathering to honor what had happened on this stretch of polished floor months earlier. The familiar concourse smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel. For Ethan, the echoes were stronger. The sudden cry, the dropped cup of hot chocolate, the desperate counting of compressions. He could almost feel the pulse he'd searched for under his fingers. Yet today the air felt lighter, as if the space itself had exhaled after holding its breath for so long. A handful of airline employees waited with quiet smiles. A few passengers lingered nearby, sensing something worth pausing for. There were no flashing cameras or scripted speeches, only the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional boarding call breaking like distant waves. An airport manager stepped forward with a simple welcome. He spoke briefly about everyday travelers becoming unexpected heroes, and how one ordinary gate had become a reminder of possibility. Then a maintenance worker and a gate agent together pulled away a cloth draped over a bronze plaque set into the wall. The engraving caught the overhead lights, clean and understated. In gratitude to those who remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. For a moment no one spoke. The quiet was almost like a held breath, the kind that fills a church after a final hymn. Ruby stepped closer and reached out, her small fingers tracing each raised letter as though committing it to memory. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying in the hush, "this is our gate now." The words settled deep in Ethan's chest. He knelt beside her, resting a hand over hers on the cool metal. All around them, travelers paused mid-stride, some smiling softly, others taking quiet photos before moving on. Margaret leaned on her cane, eyes bright, her own gratitude shimmering like the light on the plaque. Ethan felt a swell of humble pride that surprised him with its gentleness. This wasn't the roaring applause of a headline or the brief adrenaline of an emergency call. It was something steadier, a quiet acknowledgement that a few minutes of instinct and courage could leave a mark, as permanent as any monument. Months of reflection, of late-night doubts and careful choices came together in that simple moment. He thought of the nights he'd stayed awake, questioning whether his life still carried the same purpose, and of Ruby's steady presence reminding him that heroism isn't loud. It endures in the quiet spaces where love and responsibility meet. The ceremony ended without fanfare. A few airline workers hugged Margaret. A pilot shook Ethan's hand and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us what matters." Ruby tugged at his sleeve and smiled, eyes bright as if she understood the deeper meaning, even without all the words. As they turned to leave, a new boarding call rang out, ordinary life resuming its rhythm. Walking back through the concourse, Ethan felt the subtle permanence of what they had shared. The plaque might gather fingerprints and dust over time, but the story behind it would keep living in the lives of the people he trained each week, in Ruby's drawings of quiet heroes, and in Margaret's music that now filled 2 homes. Heroism, he realized, could be as enduring and unassuming as a bronze inscription on a busy wall, easy to walk past, impossible to erase. Late afternoon light stretched across the living room, turning the walls a warm honey gold and setting gentle reflections on the polished wood of the upright piano. Folding chairs, borrowed from neighbors, formed a loose semicircle around Ruby's new stage, a bright rug and a music stand decorated with her own paper stars. The smell of lemon tea and fresh cookies drifted in from the kitchen, where Emily and Margaret chatted softly, their voices a calm undercurrent of anticipation. What had once been a quiet apartment now pulsed with the soft buzz of family and friends drawn together by something as simple and profound as music. Ruby sat straight on the bench, small feet barely reaching the pedals. Her dress, pale blue with tiny white buttons, made her look both younger and older than 7. Ethan stood behind her for a moment, adjusting a loose bow in her hair and whispering encouragement. When she nodded, he stepped back, heart thumping with a pride that felt different from any headline or handshake. This was slower, deeper, a kind of joy that had taken root quietly over the weeks since Gate C-12. The first note spilled into the room like light breaking through clouds. Ruby's fingers moved with care, each chord deliberate, every pause filled with the kind of concentration only a child can carry. Margaret closed her eyes, a faint smile tracing her face, as if she could hear her late husband's own hands in the melody. Emily rocked her baby gently in rhythm, the soft sway of mother and child matching the rise and fall of the music. The sound was not grand or flawless, but it was alive and full of meaning, wrapping everyone in a shared stillness. Ethan leaned against the doorway, letting the music wash over him. He thought back to that frantic morning, when everything had been noise and urgency, Ruby's cry, the clatter of coffee cups, the pounding of his own heart. Now those memories felt like the first sharp notes of a composition that had opened into something far richer. Their home, once defined by quiet survival, now sang with unexpected harmony, the laughter of new friends, the gentle argument of where to place the piano, the baby's soft coos that punctuated Ruby's practice sessions. As the piece moved into a gentle finale, his mind wandered to Rachel, his late wife. He imagined her in the empty space beside him, smiling at the sight of their daughter lost in music, at the family gathered in warmth that had seemed unreachable not so long ago. He could almost hear her voice in the hush between notes, a quiet approval that said, "Life can bloom again even after the hardest winters." When Ruby struck the final chord, the room exhaled as one. Applause rose, tender and genuine, filling every corner of the apartment. Ruby turned with a shy grin, cheeks flushed with triumph, and hopped down to receive hugs and praise. Margaret reached for her first, eyes shining. "You played with heart," she said, kissing Ruby's forehead. Emily added her own congratulations, her baby stretching a tiny hand as if to join in. Ethan drew Ruby into an embrace, feeling the small but steady beat of her heart against his chest. "You brought music back to this house," he whispered. "Your mom would be so proud." Ruby squeezed him tighter, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hum with something larger than applause, a quiet affirmation that beauty can grow out of pain when love keeps showing up. As evening settled and candles flickered low, the melody lingered long after the last guest left. It was more than a recital. It was proof that the life they were building had depth and grace, a second melody carrying them forward. Ethan stood by the piano, gratitude filling every breath, knowing that courage had turned loss into something beautiful and lasting, a song still unfolding in the heart of their home. A soft evening settled over the neighborhood, the kind of spring night that seems to hold its breath just long enough for everyone to notice. Ethan strung the last of the warm lights across the backyard fence as the air filled with the scent of lilacs and the gentle smoke of grilled corn. The bulbs glowed like small suns against the deepening blue, casting a honeyed glow over the patch of grass that had become, almost without planning, a gathering place for the people who had changed his life. Margaret arrived first, leaning lightly on her cane, but moving with more strength than the day he met her. Emily followed, the baby bundled in a soft blanket and already half asleep, the tiny sounds of her breathing blending with the quiet rhythm of the evening. Ruby darted between them, excitement bright on her face, before settling at the upright piano they had positioned near the open window so her music could spill outside. The first notes floated into the night, delicate as the falling petals from the lilac bush. Margaret began to hum along, her voice weaving a gentle harmony through Ruby's melody. Emily rocked the baby in time, a slow sway that seemed to deepen the quiet rather than break it. Ethan stood back and watched, feeling no need to speak. The ordinary details, fireflies tracing soft arcs over the garden, the faint hiss of corn on the grill, took on the weight of something timeless. He thought of how it all began, a frantic 30 seconds on the polished floor of Gate C12, Ruby's cry shattering the air, his own heart pounding as he pressed life back into a stranger's chest. At the time it had felt like chaos compressed into a single point of urgency. Now, listening to the music and the low murmur of voices, he understood it differently. That moment hadn't been an ending or even a single miracle. It had been an opening, the first note of a piece still unfolding. In the weeks since, their world had expanded in ways he couldn't have scripted. Margaret and Emily had become more than friends. They felt like family stitched in by something deeper than blood. His quiet return to the EMS world, training recruits, sharing the human side of crisis, had brought back a sense of purpose without the fear of losing the life he cherished with Ruby and Emily. He caught her eyes across the garden now, the way her smile carried warmth without expectation. Nothing about their connection was rushed, but it grew in steady layers, a companionship born from resilience rather than escape. Ruby shifted into a softer piece, her small fingers sure on the keys, and Ethan's thoughts turned, as they often did, to Rachel. He imagined his late wife seated beside him in the dusk, listening with a proud smile, seeing their daughter not only safe, but blooming. The grief of her absence had once been a locked room inside him. Tonight it felt like a window open to the breeze, the ache still there, but no longer dark. As the music drifted on, Margaret closed her eyes and hummed a low harmony. Emily's baby sighed in sleep. Even the night seemed to listen. Ethan felt a quiet realization settle over him, steady and certain. The miracle wasn't only that he had saved a life in those urgent minutes. The miracle was that life had saved him back, had taken the fractured pieces of loss and fear and arranged them into something whole, filled with friendship, love, and music that would last. When Ruby played her final note, it hung in the air like a blessing. No one clapped. They simply let the sound fade into the soft spring night, a forever kind of quiet that felt like everything they had been given and everything still to come. If this story moved you, share a comment about what part touched your heart most. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of Everyday Miracles and Quiet Courage.